A lot of PCs in the 1990s were custom built, either by their owner or a smaller local shop. But as the decade progressed and prices fell, mass-produced desktops increased in popularity. Were they as limited in terms of upgrades as some people are led to believe? Let's find out. I picked up a Dell from 1997, a time when computer technology was advancing at breakneck speed. It's a Dimension XPS D266, which, based on the front panel badges, uses a Pentium 2 processor running at 266 MHz. Pre-built machines from this time got a bit of a bad reputation for being highly integrated and minimally upgradable, as competition between manufacturers was fierce and margins were slim. Some, though, didn't live up to this and proved to be excellent values, and I was curious how this Dell stacked up. Based on the drive bays, it does look like this machine has seen at least some changes over the years. A DVD-ROM drive was added on, along with a second floppy drive? Hey, whatever makes you happy. The back panel looks a bit less exciting with sound, network, modem, and video cards, and the motherboard only has ports for PS2, parallel, serial, and USB 1. Before I pop the side panel to check out the inside, I set the system up to give it a quick power-on test. It came with its original keyboard and mouse, which were quite dirty. I'll definitely be cleaning them later. The Dimension came to life, and hitting the delete key got me into the BIOS. It picked up one hard drive and the two optical drives, and reported having 160 megabytes of RAM. But what's this? It says it's running at 333 megahertz? The model number up at the top of the screen even says it's a D333 as well. Let's crack this machine open to figure out what the deal is. I don't think overclocking is possible with this system, so maybe it got a CPU swap. This would be a good opportunity to check out the cards as well, so I slid off the side panel after undoing a single captive thumb screw. The CPU is held in with this blue retention bracket, then I could press its release tabs and lift it out. We'll discuss this era of processors in a little bit. Out next came the expansion cards. I kinda suspected some of these were the originals, but sound and video upgrades were common during this era, so nothing would have really surprised me. I opted to also pull the drive so we could get a better look at them. The opticals just needed to have 2 screws removed from each, then they slid out, and that second floppy drive only had 1. The hard drive sits upside down, and to take it out I had to pop the front bezel off. Dell made this easy by marking 3 latches you needed to push, then it could simply hinge away from the chassis. After that, 1 screw in the front was all that was keeping the hard drive in place. And that drive is a 40 gigabyte Western Digital, so it's definitely been swapped in at a later date, at least 2004 based on the label. The upper optical drive is a 12x CD-ROM from Mitsumi, and I think it's the original as its own label lists a manufacturer date of February 1997. The lower optical is an Acer 10x DVD-ROM from April 2000, a time when that format was really taking off. Finally, that second floppy drive isn't anything special, just an ordinary one from Samsung. I guess the owner just liked floppy disks. The cards proved to be an interesting mix. Video is an NVIDIA Riva 128, one of the first consumer cards with integrated 3D acceleration. When it launched in 1997, it was a compelling option, but with only 4 megabytes of memory and the rapid pace of advancement, it was pretty quickly left behind. The network card is a solid 10100 Ethernet controller made by Intel, whose other main competitor at the time was 3Com. The modem is nothing special, a cheap PC-Tel 56K unit. But the sound card came out of left field, an ESS audio drive in ISA format. This was definitely not the Dell's original card for 2 reasons. First, some research suggests that it shipped with a Sound Blaster AW64, and second, because this is actually an OEM card out of a compact. I decided to keep it in the machine but add another sound card for comparison, a Sound Blaster 128. This card was originally sold by Ensoniq as the Audio PCI in July 1997, but the company was struggling financially and was acquired by Creative in early 1998. This arrangement actually helped Creative with its own problem, namely that it didn't have a viable competitor in the PCI sound card market. Ensoniq's technology and engineers also contributed towards the Sound Blaster Live from that same year, which proved to be a well-regarded and popular product. The Sound Blaster 128 stayed in the lineup as a lower-cost option, and I was curious to see, or rather hear, how it stacked up. In place of the Riva, I decided to go with a card I have fond memories of, an ATI Rage 128. This is specifically known as the Expert 128 in that it came with 16 megabytes of video memory, whereas the 32 meg version was called the Rage Fury. I was looking forward to seeing how this card performed when I got the XPS put all back together. First though, the CPU. It's indeed a Pentium 2, the 333 MHz version, so the computer did see this one swapped in at some point. It looks very different to processors that came before and after in that it uses the Slot 1 interface, where the CPU is integrated into a PCB that mounts vertically onto the motherboard. This series was launched in early 1997, and the form factor came about as a way for Intel to get better yields out of its processor manufacturing. Something that greatly improves performance in any CPU is the addition of Level 2 cache memory. The P2 was based on the Pentium Pro, a chip where the cache was built into the processor package. The problem is, if either the CPU die or the cache failed testing, the entire chip was rejected. As Intel developed the Pentium 2 architecture, it found that failure rates were even higher. But by separating the two, dies and caches could be tested individually before committing them to the carrier PCB. This form factor had its pros and cons. Installation was significantly easier, and there were no worries about bending CPU pins. But motherboard manufacturers found that Slot 1 CPUs put lateral stress on their connectors and had to include mounting brackets to support them. Heatsinks could be annoying at times too, with some manufacturers deciding to rivet them in place, like in this Dell. The Pentium 2 wasn't the only CPU to use Slot 1, however. At its launch, it was the fastest consumer processor available, but that power came at a cost. AMD's K6 line of chips, while not as fast, were a lot cheaper and proved popular in lower-end computers. Intel didn't want to give up that market, so it introduced Celeron, a less expensive chip based on the Pentium 2, but designed to cut costs. When it debuted in April 1998, Celeron got off to a rocky start. Intel had omitted a Level 2 cache entirely, and performance suffered. The company addressed this shortcoming in the next revision, launched in August that same year, by including 128 kilobytes of cache. This was less than the Pentium 2's 512K, but what tightened the gap was that the Celeron's cache ran at full clock speed, whereas the Pentium's ran at half. What's more, these Celerons proved to be very amenable to overclocking, with enthusiasts often getting an extra 100 MHz or more out of them with relatively little effort. You could end up with a processor that performed as well as a P2 for much less money. Eventually, Intel figured out its production yield struggles and moved away from Slot 1 to the new Socket 370 midway through the Pentium 3's lifecycle. It used the more typical pin grid array format, but owners of older motherboards weren't left out in the cold. Adapters called slockets, a portmanteau of slot and socket, basically allowed newer Socket 370 chips to be installed in Slot 1 systems. Before I reassembled the Dimension, I gave its capacitors a quick inspection. These were from just before the so-called capacitor plague era and, visually at least, look just fine. I can replace them later if needed. I also noticed an interesting omission: pads where audio and joystick ports would go. It turns out that the XPS series could be had with onboard audio, which used a Yamaha chipset, but higher-end models dropped that in favor of the AW64 card. But the knockouts for those jacks remained on the back panel. My original plan was to omit the DVD and second floppy drive, since I wouldn't need them, but the blank bezel arrangement in this Dell is somewhat proprietary, and I couldn't get any of the generic spares I had to work. So they went back in, along with the rest of the parts, and I tried to tidy up the internal cabling a bit, though that wasn't really much of a concern back then. The XPS's casing wasn't very dirty, but I cleaned up some of the dust and spots of grime that remained. The same couldn't be said for the keyboard, which needed some attention. I've had good luck using all-purpose cleaner for this, though of course cleaning keyboards is time-consuming no matter what. I also wiped down the mouse, which was a simple 2-button affair with a ball instead of optical sensor. And it also revealed an interesting tidbit. It was manufactured for Dell by Logitech. I powered the computer on and tried to get in the BIOS, but the keyboard didn't want to respond. Even the num and caps lock keys weren't working. Some of the cleaner must have gotten inside. Good thing I've got a spare to use while I wait for the other to dry out. One thing I wanted to change in the BIOS was to enable plug-and-play support, because unlike the badge on the front, I plan to install Windows 98 instead of 95, and that OS would take better advantage of it. That is, if I could get it installed. I dropped in a CD as well as a 98 boot floppy, but ran across some errors. The CD-ROM driver was reporting as being corrupted, and when I got to the command prompt, it couldn't find command.com. This disk has worked fine in the past, but I tried a Windows 95 one instead since it doesn't really matter. That got me much further along, then I could format the hard drive and copy the Windows 98 setup files over to it, to make installation much quicker. I got to the point during setup where it wanted to make a boot floppy. I dropped in that original disk to rebuild it, but after a moment it popped up an error about a bad sector. I still needed a 98 boot disk, so I put a blank one in instead, and it came back with the same thing again. I think I know why there's a second drive in this computer now. Windows 98 had drivers for everything but the video card and Sound Blaster. To make things easier, I installed mass storage drivers so I could copy files over using a USB flash drive. Interestingly, both AMD and Creative still host legacy drivers on their websites, which certainly makes things easier for vintage computer enthusiasts. Okay, how does the Rage 128 stack up? My favorite test is with Quake 3 Arena, which I have fond memories of. I left the resolution at 640 by 480, but cranked up other settings, then kicked off a demo. I remember playing this around the turn of the millennium on a similar video card and always thought performance was decent. So imagine my surprise when it came back at barely 25 frames per second. I ran the demo again at default settings and it scored only about 1 FPS better. These days we're used to seeing triple-digit frame rates at high resolutions, but in the late 90s, this was typical. 60 frames per second was a luxury, and 30 to 40 was normal. We were thankful for what we could get. How about that sound cart shootout then? Personally, I prefer the MIDI performance of the Sound Blaster, but the audio drive is well regarded when it comes to DOS gaming. This isn't a case of one being better than the other necessarily, but rather suited for different tasks. Overall, I'm impressed with this Dell. I was expecting a machine a bit more proprietary, with more obvious corner cutting, but it's almost as flexible as a similar custom-built PC. Of course, this wasn't a budget machine. D266s with 17-inch Trinitron monitor sold for between $2,400 and $2,900 US. For that kind of money, I'd expect something that could handle upgrades as they came along. And based on the parts we found in this one, apparently so did its previous owner as well. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Please consider supporting my work over on Patreon, and as always, thanks for watching.